Hello. This unit is meant to introduce students to the foundations of the American democratic experience, in particular to the history and political ideology of the founding of the United States. Politics were then, as now, extremely conflictual. The answer to the question of what should government do was as diverse and divisive as the young country itself. Democracy grew slowly. Democratic institutions, to the degree that they did exist, did so in limited scope and structure. Perhaps no other example illustrates the political divisions of the United States than a study of regionalism during the early Republic period. The political development of each state was influenced heavily by the forces which led to its initial colonization. Many of these states were colonized and peopled 100 years or more before the American Revolution. Religious differences informed the geographic distribution of certain demographic groups. In New England, Puritans prevailed, while Quakers dominated Pennsylvania. Anglicans and Catholics both occupied the Chesapeake, with the Anglicans dominating Virginia and Catholics residing in Maryland. The South was mainly peopled and occupied by Anglicans. Additionally, numerous Protestant sects found places where they could preserve and practice their particular religious beliefs. Pennsylvania had a majority German speaking population in the lead up to the American Revolution. Economically, a merchant dominated class dominated the northern regions of the United States, while agriculture was the prevalent form in the South. This impacted the attitudes toward institutions like slavery, as well as lower class whites. Individualism in the South prevailed, where there was little regulation of individual businesses, as well as very little support for public institutions like schools. However, in the North, collectivist institutions like public schools, orphanages were funded by tax dollars collected at the city and state levels. Political power expressed itself differently through self government as well. New England, a rich tradition of Congregationalism which blended the political and religious influences of the church and the city government, prevailed well into the 19th century. Massachusetts, for example, chartered a state church within its first state constitution. In this model, the city and the town had very little oversight from state governments. On the other hand, in the South, property ownership was the primary prerequisite for political power, and the parish or the county exerted almost absolute control over the town, which actually had very little power and authority. These different structures of society and government presented competing views of liberty, freedom, and equality. These were expressed differently amongst these societies and produced unique political cultures. Religious, economic, and cultural rivalries emerged, as many of these states developed in isolation and actually viewing each other as rivals. These tensions undermine the ability of political leadership to organize the country under one unified government as the American Revolution took shape. Many of the disagreements about the proper role of government, should government fund schools, should it preserve individual liberty and stay out of the public sphere, um, these boiled over during the Revolutionary War and manifested themselves in the tension between patriots, those in favor of American independence, and loyalists, those who opposed it. Much of the bloodiest fighting during the American War for Independence was not between British troops and American colonists, but rather amongst the Americans themselves. Additionally, while it seemed that during the American Revolution every American was either a patriot or a loyalist, a significant number remained undecided. It would be this paradigm which would later be recalled by John Adams. He famously proclaimed that one third of the Americans were for the war, one third of Americans were against it, and one third were neither for or against it, implying that the Revolution, as other important political movements in American history, were not something that the majority of Americans supported. Conventionally regarded as the founding document of the United States, the American Declaration of Independence expressed notions of political individualism and classical liberalism, which derive much of their inspiration from the political philosopher John Locke. Locke's critique of the hereditary rights of kings found substantial support amongst Americans during the Revolutionary period. The expropriation of Lockean principles was nothing new to the Americas. In South Carolina, Locke actually composed the state's earliest governing document in 1669. It expressed a fundamental mistrust of collective political action as well as an embrace of radical individualism. During the Revolution in particular, the notion of private property became a central tenet, and any coordinated government action on the part of the British, like taxation, which could potentially infringe individual property rights, was deemed a threat to freedom and liberty. It is here that most Americans found common ground during the Revolutionary period and managed to overcome their regional differences, at least for the time being. The perception that the British Empire had overreached and was actively subjugating the Americans with their oppressive taxes and trade policies created a language where economic liberty meant freedom, and the alternative resembled something akin to slavery. It was expressing this notion that Patrick Henry famously decried, "Give me liberty or give me death." Yet, while today we use such terms like liberty, freedom, and equality almost interchangeably, one may say today that without equality there can be no liberty, or without liberty and equality there cannot be freedom. These terms nonetheless meant different things to different people during the Revolution, depending on what region they came from. In societies where in societies which were stratified based on wealth and status, property ownership, equality was something that was shunned and dismissed politically. The notion that men were born free was actually derived from a German political theory, Freiheit. Many Englishmen, and certainly Anglicans, saw freedom as something which was earned, and saw no contradiction between having a free society underpinned by slave labor. Their freedom and liberty was supported by depriving others of theirs. This was certainly the case in states like South Carolina and Virginia. In other parts of America, more egalitarian values defined society, with towns and counties throughout New England taxing themselves in order to fund public institutions like schools, universities, and orphanages. It is hard also to dismiss the crucial role that religion, rather than property rights, played as an alternative form of social organization. In the South, on the other hand, the education of children fell to individual families. One received the education one could afford. Some of the most memorable principles of the Declaration of Independence would go unrealized for some time. The economics and logistics of independence required collective political action. The United States would need to construct a coherent and unified economic policy in order to pay for the war, and the Americans' aversion to a standing army would finally give way as the country realized that national security would require greater military power. The Declaration of Independence did prove powerful in the hearts and minds of Americans and has withstood the test of time. Yet, rather than expressing a set of laws or stating a legal doctrine, it appears to be a creed, an expression of faith in an albeit idealistic characterization of the American character. It is important to note that the democratic spirit of equality expressed in the Declaration of Independence did not immediately materialize in the United States Constitution or its predecessor, the Articles of Confederation. The United States, it was expected, would not be a democracy. Rather, it would be ruled by proprietors, men who held wealth and could thus put aside their self interest and instead focus on the good of the country itself. It apparently did not occur to Americans that these men might use their positions of power to enrich themselves. The following quotes from John Jay, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton demonstrate the firm belief that these Federalists had in legitimizing and affirming the role of proprietors, rather than allowing the ignorant masses to be manipulated by populists into certain self destruction. This class of political leaders would, above all, protect the new republic from self interested and factious political actors who would certainly undermine the stability of the new republic. In a letter to a counterpart in Great Britain, John Jay, trying to explain the revolutionary fervor to his friend who couldn't quite understand what was going on at the time, wrote, "Are not the proprietors of the soil of Great Britain lords of their own property? Can it be taken from them without their consent? Will they yield it to the arbitrary disposal of any man, or number of men whatever? You know they will not. Why then are the proprietors of the soil of America less lords of their property than you are of yours? Or why should they submit it to the disposal of your parliament, or any other parliament or council in the world not of their election?" John Jay would go on, amongst other things, to be Chief Justice Supreme Court. Nearly 20 years later, the author of the American Constitution, James Madison, would echo Jay's sentiment. Government is instituted to protect property of every sort, as well as that which lies in the various rights of individuals, as that which the term particularly expresses. This being the end of government, that alone is a just government, which impartially secures to every man whatever is his own. It is in this regard that we understand the fear of democracy by the founders of the United States. It was expected that if democracy were to prevail, the masses would expropriate the wealth of the few in order to indirectly enrich themselves. This idea that the masses would use the power of taxation against economic elites was something that men like Alexander Hamilton expressed quite neatly. It has been observed that a pure democracy, if it were practicable, would be the most perfect government. Experience has proved that no position is more false than this. The ancient democracies in which the people themselves deliberated never possessed one good feature of government. Their very character was tyranny, their figure deformity. Hamilton had the idea that economic elites, proprietors, were best positioned to secure the long-term success and economic prosperity as well as political stability that was required in order to secure the success of the American Republic. While 1776 was an important year as far as the founding of the United States was concerned, despite the fact that the features of democracy we recognize today would not emerge for some time to come, the ideas expressed in the Declaration of Independence would slowly affect the political culture of the U.S. It could be said, therefore, that the birth of American democracy began in the year 1776, despite the fact that many of the founding fathers either opposed it directly or simply could not envision American democracy in practice. Yet 1776 was also notable for the release of an influential economic tract, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. Today, Smith is known as the father of capitalism. His ideas of free markets with minimal government interference were recognized by some of the early American founders, namely Alexander Hamilton. Yet, like with democracy, American capitalism had a slow and somewhat unexpected birth. Smith argued that markets, if left to the forces of rational self-interest, had the capacity to thrive and effectively regulate themselves. Governments should avoid regulation and leave it to the invisible hand of free markets to provide for their own state's economic prosperity. For Smith, like Locke, private property rights were an absolute imperative in a modern state. This endeared him to many Americans seeking economic liberty. However, for Hamilton, this was insufficient. Hamilton was critical of Smith's theory because he believed that government had a duty to promote economic activity rather than simply stay out of economic affairs. Hamilton viewed the government as having the ability and obligation to grow the American economy using every tool at its disposal. What emerged was a mixed private public economy where the government would protect and enhance the interests of private American capital with public resources, building roads, canals, bridges, instituting tariffs, providing land grants and other subsidies. The government was able to set the stage for the development of capitalism in America. Hamilton's vision, which was continued after his death, was known as the American system, the mixed public private economy. After signing the Declaration of Independence, many of the delegates of the Continental Congress left Philadelphia and returned to their home states in order to begin the process of drafting new governing documents for their own states, namely their state constitutions. These early state constitutions represented the distinct regional values and core beliefs of each polity. For example, in Massachusetts, where Congregationalism formed the basis for self-government, the new Constitution established the state church that existed well into the 19th century. That state also chartered public schools and outlawed the institution of slavery within its boundaries. In states like Virginia, however, the separation of church and state had significant support and led to a series of measures expressing freedom of religion and limited the role of religion in the political realm. On the other hand, the Virginia Constitution, like some of its southern counterparts, included strong protections on property rights, including human property. They refused to outlaw slavery and would eventually restrict masters' abilities to manumit slaves within the boundaries of Virginia. Differences like these underscored the diverse political landscape of the United States. While the states represented the highest forms of political sovereignty, a national government was also organized under what was known as the Articles of Confederation. The character of the Articles of Confederation demonstrated and informed America's apprehension and fear of a central government, and thus granted the national government very little power. As the war ended and disagreements between the states emerged, it became apparent that the Articles were insufficient in governing a growing and regionally diverse nation. A push was made by James Madison and Alexander Hamilton to fortify the Articles and strengthen the national government. The delegates to the Constitutional Convention came with this purpose in mind. Yet, knowing that there were numerous disagreements amongst themselves, which, if made public, could undermine the entire process, they decided to hold the debates private. Among the sources between the delegates at the Constitutional Convention were issues related to majority versus minority rights, the interests of large states versus small states, the proper role of legislative power versus executive power, the national power versus state and local power, as well as slave states versus non-slave states. The little common ground they had laid in their firm and persistent belief in property. It is impossible to understand and appreciate the Constitution of the United States without seeing the primary role that property rights played in its formulation. It was the source of compromise against these diverse groups. Protecting and stabilizing property rights meant ensuring political stability to these men. It represented their primary motive. While today many of us think about individual rights, personal freedoms, and have visions of equality which define our conception of the Constitution, those of us that do are actually thinking of the Bill of Rights. The original Constitution, which did not include a Bill of Rights, did not even mention the word equality that has become so central to our notion of democracy. On the other hand, the memorable clause, "we the people," can be understood to mean a number of things. Yet, in the golden age of states' rights, it posed a vital counterpoint to the issue of consent. Would it be the states which provided the consent and ultimate legitimacy to this new form of government? Or would consent come directly from the people and perhaps indirectly circumscribe the authority and power of state and local governments? This question, did states consent to the Union and reserve the right to withdraw as in a compact, would not be answered until the Civil War answered it with a definitive no. The Constitution was a contract where no state would have the right to leave or withdraw if it disagreed with the laws or policies thereof. Yet this was not a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, as Abraham Lincoln remembered in his Gettysburg Address. And that clause actually does not appear in the document at all. The Constitution laid out the structural framework for a much stronger federal government, while promising to share power with the states, who, despite Alexander Hamilton's suggestion, kept their individual constitutions intact. Hamilton believed that with a federal government, a stronger federal government, there would be no need for state constitutions. Nonetheless, the new Constitution did give disproportionately more power to the federal government. In theory, power flowed from the states to the federal government and vice versa. In practice, that flow has been the subject of vast controversy. What the status of personal freedoms or states' rights was after the ratification of the Constitution would become the essence of debate in American politics.